I believe that you are.
I'm sure.
You are
Congratulations to both teams. This has been an incredible tournament for both of you all, and the decision was a 4-1 for the affirmative from Lake. I sat, which I kind of thought that I might. Kansas, congratulations on a great tournament. I thought that you debated really well. Clearly, I thought that Lake, you all were awesome, and I really enjoy judging you every time I do. So, thank you for letting me. The round, the way that I see it, is that having a limited stasis point for debate allows for an iterative process of contestation that leads to nuanced forms of education over a number of forms of literature basis. So that's just like, I think that Clash is good, and we should have a limited definition and a stasis point to have that. I think that there are technical concessions in the 1AR and 2AR that, despite me wanting to vote AF in a number of places, make it really hard for me to vote AF in those places, and it hurts the AF in two ways. I think that, I think that the concessions, I don't have a really good explanation from the AF on why my ballot or voting AF means that I can kind of address some of the structural fairness issues within debate. And I think that in every single negative speech, there's a very, very clear articulation about why my ballot cannot change structural forces within debate. It can only resolve procedural forces. So I think the affirmative is very good on structural fairness. It affects and can change procedural fairness within debate, but I don't know why the affirmative resolves that structural fairness, and that makes it hard for me to vote AF. And so that means that my ballot is just on kind of who did the better debating and the impacts of debate and Clash itself. And it also means that I can't resolve, it means that I can only resolve procedural fairness with my ballot. I think that for the interpretation debate, the 2NR has a couple answers to the AF interpretation that make me lean neg here. First is that greenhouse gas emissions is distinct from like the elements. So even though your card is very, very good on like climate is, there's a climate and that climate is anti-blackness. There's also an argument you have to meet kind of every portion of the resolution, and that jettisoning one portion of the resolution means that you can just define like one, you can meet one part. So you can meet like restrict, but you don't have to meet climate policy. You can meet USFG, but you don't have to meet greenhouse gas emissions or whatever. And I think that there's a second 2NR argument that even though the interpretations of the affirmative are very clear on every part of the resolution, like even if you had an interpretation of every single word within the resolution and you fall under that, that's not grounded in literature that you have forwarded in this debate, and so it's unpredictable for the negative. So like when people are doing research, this is not like a way, like they can't determine that this is going to be the affirmative, because the way that we determine predictability is based on doing 3-round research. The topical version of the app, I think, solves a lot more offense than probably the rest of the panel thinks you do. First, the negative has made an argument that a stasis point for debate leads to better debates about anti-blackness. We lead to nuanced forms of education because no one would have had an incentive to say cut a card about anti-blackness specifically in the context of a carbon tax if there's not a very clear limited resolution that we have interpreted as a community. I think that's just, I don't have a very good answer of that in the 1AR or 2AR.
Well, my answer is that the TVA that they've given, for example, will be included under our interpretation as long as they can confront the total climate of anti-blackness, which means if you're negative, you can cut a fucking card to the app.
Well, I think two things. First is that I think that you saying that the topical version of the app can fall underneath your interpretation kind of mitigates a lot of your offense against the topical version of the app, because it means that the topical version of the app can be used as an effective challenge
It means
to
it's topical.
anti-blackness.
Questions of solvency are not questions of topical.
You have
Would
described
you
your
mind if we maybe ask questions? Can I get my decision to them and then we come back? Would that be alright?
Yeah.
I was just doing it because we're going to probably go prep while you're talking to them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that the topical version of the app solves at least part of the offense of the affirmative, because you can address anti-blackness as a structuring issue for climate policy and emissions, and that the reason that because the topical version of the app, because you all have said that it falls underneath your interpretation, I'm not quite sure how you can then apply a lot of your offense to it. Does that make sense? Like, you've described your interpretation of the debate as developing a climate policy or centering Black death in a discussion about climate change and understanding the atmosphere as one of an atmosphere of anti-blackness. If that is your interpretation of debate, and you have said that the topical version of the app can be used under that interpretation, then a lot of your arguments about why it can't be an effective challenge to anti-blackness, I'm not sure how to resolve that. Does that make sense? Okay.
I get what you're saying.
And I think that is kind of the gist of my decision, is that with those two things, topical version of the app mitigating a lot of your offense, also me not thinking that the ballot can be an effective way to resolve structural fairness within debate, means I give a lot more credence to the education disads that are being extended in the two app.
Is it okay if I go?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, good job, both teams. Great job, Meg. Great job all year. I thought you all did a lot of really good things in this debate. I thought it was super close, and I suspect that they'll be back in future years. I appreciate, I thought you all improved framework stuff a lot since I first saw you. I appreciate you included some of the things that I've asked for in previous rounds of Judge You All. I think your meta strategy is sound. For me, I thought it was a couple answers type situations where they were just a couple spin things from the half. But I thought they did a good job on it. I thought you all needed to grapple with a little bit more. I guess a couple suggestions for both teams on the counter interpretation. I do agree with Ava that the mootness argument from the negative, it would be good to have an app answer to that. Even if you meet some parts of the resolution, there's other parts of the resolution that you don't meet. I think for me, the best answer to that app is if you just kind of say you meet the most important parts of the resolution, that it's not the same. So to meet domestic climate policy and to meet restrict GHG emissions and not meet some other stuff is different than if an app was like, other less important words, like the app is like, we don't, we move in the United States, or we meet in the United States, so we meet the rest of it, or we, meet private sector, but we move the other stuff. You haven't, said you meet some irrelevant part, you said you've met the central core part of the resolution, so I think that's a way to fight back against that. I wish the NEC had maybe done a little bit more with the app definition and what it would allow and why that's bad. So, I'm with you a lot on just kind of it's messed up for the app to say they only need parts of the resolution. I think it would have helped to do a little bit more on why the parts that they don't need are important. So why is moving the state important, even outside of just kind of generic mootness arguments? Why is it important for the NEC to be able to have arguments about the state? And, I think I'm sympathetic to your approach in this round. I'm concerned about what the place of the negative is in order to answer, the triad of black debate or staying in the hole. I don't think there should be an expectation that you are prepared to debate that, but it would help me if you flush that out. What are the things that would be allowed under interpretation? What are the things that they move and the problems that creates? I also think we should have done a little bit more with some of the impact stuff. I thought, a place I really thought about a lot was some of the kind of rigorous truth testing necessary in order to provide utility and do something with the education that the app provides. I thought that was a really strong argument. I thought the Trump stuff, while extended, was not extended as great. I think one thing that would have helped would have been just sort of like a rant about why Trump should be the thing that concerns us the most, which I guess a lot of people would be very sympathetic to. But it was just sort of, there was just kind of like, Trump's bad, this isn't serious, not Trump, which fair enough. I do know why Trump's bad, but I think in terms of like a compelling to and R, you could have been impacted with, you know, the AF has both some very specific claims about debate and some very general claims about the nature of anti-blackness, but the thing that we need to be working on, the thing that's really causing the most anti-blackness is Trump, and the differences, even if the Democratic Party is fucked up, or, you know, some of the people who are resisting Trump are messed up, the differences between the two are incredibly extreme and important, and it affects the Muslim ban, and it affects, you know, school lunches, and it affects things that have a material consequence that should be more important. So I sort of wish there had been that, you know, rhetorical appeal to why this has to be the thing that comes first. As it was just kind of left hanging out there as like, this is necessary to fight Trump, and I thought it did a really good job. The truth testing argument, I guess the reason why I didn't just sort of check in on that is I thought the AF did have kind of a breadth versus depth type argument, that in order to have rigorous testing, it's not just the depth and answer of arguments that's important, but the number of arguments that are included are necessary for rigorous testing, because if the scope of what we're debating about and examining is smaller, that means that there isn't as much testing going on. So I had this as the kind of AF's white echo chamber argument. I did think the AF had answered the topical version of the AF argument. Even kind of starting in the 1AC, they had this argument about how it's not really fossil fuels that kill black folks, it's anti-blackness. And the only explanation I had in 2 and R for the topical version of the AF is, you know, fossil fuels are anti-black, and I thought consistently through every speech they kind of said it's not the thing that we're talking about, the AF that we're trying to have are not about the actual things that are just the symptoms, but about the causes. So I needed an answer to that as well. So that to me provided the AF a little bit of shield and some offense on truth testing to say perhaps it's not rigorously tested, and that's for me a powerful defensive argument. I have some concerns about that. There's also maybe similar concerns about the neg because of the scope of what's being examined limits truth testing and creates a white echo chamber as the AF described. And then once I thought they had a little bit of inroads there, I thought the AF's impact comparison on kind of offense Trump versus use of debate as a site to resist anti-blackness was more important. Okay. So if I can go about Yeah, of course, great job, Bill. Great year.
This was largely an impact debate on the basis why I voted. I think that the negative term offers a more predictable debate for the negative, with better ground for the negative, creating procedural fairness and second level better responses. There's some uniqueness questions on several of those. I think the AF is a generic, broad understanding of domestic climate policy, so it isn't just their stuff and a bunch of other stuff. It is certainly much larger, but does have some limit in some way on what's allowable. I think the negative wins a predictability disad, though only somewhat unique. I think that's hashed out early in cross-ex and said throughout. The truth testing claim, I don't think that means you ignore every single AF claim, and the way that they become somewhat predictable, I think, is one of those you simply accept it. Plus, I don't think there's ever really a good, you should be able to think on your feet better in rounds answer. And there's also potentially better topic literature, though it excludes what the AF is. The AF interp gives some limit on the topic, though obviously less than the neg, allows debates that the neg wants to have, but is the only interp that encourages rev debates, avoids the access disad, and has a chance to actually respond to anti-blackness, which also structures everything. I ultimately decided the AF impacts and the AF impact assessment means that while the neg interp is in fact more limiting and creates more predictability for the neg, that's outweighed by avoiding the access disad, avoiding traumatizing those who are forced to debate under the auspices of saying civil society good, and that structural fairness is in fact more important than procedural fairness. Embedded in all of this is that the neg's gradient understanding of anti-blackness is a reason to be skeptical of much of the neg's claims. Now, I couldn't give you like a percentage that means, but it means like it cuts back for sure against the truth testing claims, and I'm not entirely sure that the AF is wrong. That the AF is wrong about this, but I think you all accepted that way too easily, and just the played defense only on the what do we do with that argument, rather than that is not what we said, that was not our argument. But I thought that cross-ex exchange was handled really well by the affirmative, and that they fundamentally made it so that it seemed like you were fine with some forms of anti-blackness and not others, that later on you clarified to be other things. The only other thing that I want to say is that the impact assessment, more than anything, really coded all of this. And there was a sort of a sloppy debate in a bunch of places on both sides. Like, for instance, I could probably be one on the why Trump is uniquely worse for anti-blackness, though you should easily be able to answer this back. That while Trump sucks, he's not foundationally different from civil society generally. And so I think you're doing all the things you need to win your arguments. I really just think you need to impact them more. And given that, with the absence of an explicit 2NR impact assessment, I'm left only with a couple of cards that y'all have, and they're okay, but I don't think that they stack up nearly as well to the acts. It means that social death precludes evaluating most of the arguments that the neg is making in the first place. I think they simply have bigger impacts. That means I need more from you or better cards explaining why procedural fairness and second level claims are ultimately able to outweigh what the AF does.
I agree with several things that Varda said. I think the irony of the 2NR is that it's branded as topicality but needs more T debating portions and minutia. In terms of kind of the description of my decision, I'd say that it's the 2NR kind of chooses the wrong set of arguments to feature from your long 2NC overview. I think that your net benefit, I think that you went a very large risk to excluding the state as this sort of portion of the stasis point is extremely unpredictable for a certain set of arguments, but I think that you have lost the impact of that exclusion in terms of our ability to drill down deep into the literature is just outweighed in that it comes at the cost of black innovation in debate, and does so in a way that I think doesn't necessarily just outweigh your truth testing argument, but also turns it in a lot of ways, because it means that the neg's construction of topicality becomes sort of an opportunity cost with more important forms of truth testing. I think the big problem for me, though, in terms of just sort of like a central tension in terms of the 2NR, is that a lot of your impact framing sort of picks a set of terms that presumes the dialectical opposite of it is anti-stasis and anti-topic and anti-resolution, that the AF should be filed under the heading topic broken, discard topic, start over, and does not account for this species of AF, which is the heading we are topical, we have a counter-interpretation. From the perspectives of the T world, do I think their interpretation has a good limit, would be predictable, would have a predictable set of terms that can channel debate over the course of the year? No, I do not, but I don't think that's debating that you all do. For example, a comparison about why greenhouse gas as term of art is important, because if we take it to the element of atoms, how am I to distinguish a hydrogen molecule from something else, given that it's all just recombination of electrons, neutrons, and protons? I think that this is just sort of a level of minutia you need to get into to show that there is no reasonable form of climate policy given the way that they have chosen to define it, and especially how that maps onto literature that we would otherwise call climate policy literature. Also, I think that you need to have a better piece of kind of pushback against their arguments that TVA or switching sides comes at both kind of an empirical demonstrated opportunity cost with the way the black debaters have chosen to innovate their approaches in debate over the last several decades, or that those options would be severely constrained within their world. And I think that just needs to be better picture painting in the 2NR in terms of what those possibilities are, or even what those probabilities are, i.e. how you create a vision of the topic that is inherently heterogeneous, that allows for those opportunities, maybe a few examples of what they are. The problem is, for me, I think you leverage too much of TVA/switch side equals auto solvency because they dropped it. And I don't know if it's true that they dropped it, but I also don't know if you're filling out the positive kind of force of the claim in terms of an illustration for why those solvency claims are true, especially if they win some of their just like the truthiness portions of their affirmative. And in terms of the kind of way that the 2NR chooses to feature, I have two big impacts rather than a few other 2NC overview arguments that I think are important. The problem is I think that you've not been able to produce a real firewall that procedural fairness is exclusively not a one-way street or fundamentally distinct, and that's the Sparks evidence, which I don't think you've effectively grappled with. And I think the big issue with that is it calls into question whether there is a form-content distinction, and that I think lines up extremely well with how you've chosen to brand your own argument that if I can win that form of sort of agnosticism, then a lot of their offense is not truly offense to me. I think the Sparks evidence does call that call that into question to a great degree. In terms of the truth testing argument, I think I've already sort of discussed this. I think they sort of both outweigh and turn at the same time by winning a disad to you, precluding a more important set of logic or knowledge puzzles that need to be tested rather than what are the reasons why cap and trade might be particularly kind of anti-black. To end with a little bit of advice before I turn it over to Lindsay, I think the 2NC things that you should be featuring are not necessarily your impacts for your interpretation, but rather your kind of thick narrative descriptions about what debate is and what debate can be and how I should make decisions about the direction of channeling debate norms. And I think then paired with a much more in-depth T-driven debating of their interpretation and not relying on, hey, if it's unfair to me, then I have to vote for the negative. I think that sort of different kind of set of variables in the 2NR makes what is a very good and close debate likely favorable for you all.
I'm going to skip the part where I think you're ahead on all the top level of this, because I think that's relatively obvious at this point. Where your predictability, they are not predictable, etc. But what I will say is this. I think that one thing that's missing this debate on both sides, honestly, is a sort of what Travis is describing as like the rich description of what debate is supposed to look like under either interpretation. So I'll get to sort of what I think you could do with that after I tell you how I voted. But ultimately what I sort of end up thinking is that they win a bigger reason why what you do is bad, and then you win a reason of that for them, right? So they have a bigger DA to you than you win DA to them. So I'm with you, right? Like, obviously, if I strung together these like counter interpretations, that's not total bad that I don't understand, but like, it obviously is not an interpretation debate that's critical. It's obviously not an interpretation debate that like I would predict coming into the season, and I used to be my job at Kansas to figure out what the K teams were going to say. So I think that that's like a solid starting point. What I think though is that I'm not sure what that means for the sort of anti-black violence portions of it, except for the like you're sort of like we have a TVA, means you can do some of this stuff. And I think that they've given me several reasons to be either skeptical, like Varda says, right, when we talk about this argument that they make on the case debate, right, this gradient argument. I think you're right about your PAR evidence, right? So like, look, PAR is obviously about why anti-black violence is bad. So I don't think this is a reason to reject you at all. What I think it is, though, is the reason that they're sort of like, look, incorporating that knowledge means it's always going to go oddly in these debates, or badly, right? It's just like, be skeptical of it. So I don't think it means I have to say, you increase anti-black violence. I think that means that part of what happens here is that you're sort of getting an accumulated total of things, being skeptical that the T version of the app resolves anything, right? So that's one of the places. The second place is this white echo chamber argument, right? Which is that once we sort of recenter it back on, in this case, topical debates, or sort of the way that we think about them, then it sort of creates this ability for us just to have the same debate over and over and over again, and that debate is not necessarily one that includes questions of anti-black violence, at least not in the way that the affirmative sort of postulates. The last one is they're sort of like they're sort of a version of the state, right? And I mean or not a staff version, right? But they're a version 2 doing anything with the state. This is the place where I think you just need more pushback. You need either a neutral, like, you need either a way of being like, you say you don't have to defend the state, and I baseline capital T truth believe that to be the case, right? I have zero idea why being capital requires you to defend the state. I think that's not really anything I believe. But in this case, what I think you're sort of not really on top of is, A, that warrant all that clearly, right? You certainly say it. I don't want to say you don't say it. Certainly in the debate, but it needs to be sort of a bigger feature, and like that needs to be fleshed out. It also has to be sort of more connected to the way that they're talking about it, which is that anti-black violence is something that causes that sort of harm in both the debate sense and in sort of the bigger world sense, which means that it sort of amplifies I'm supposed to be skeptical that we can include those ideas, right? So I ultimately believe that the version of debate or the model of debate that you report is something that they're winning a sort of big disadvantage to, right? That sort of focuses around the USFG, and that the USFG should part of the resolution instead of the other parts is a problem. More reasons why the USFG should be tied to predictability, something some other people have already said. I agree with that part. More reasons why, I don't think you need more reasons why their version of the world is not predictable. I think that's
pretty clear. What I think you need is more reasons why, or more specific details about that, right? So if you really want to win some of these like predictability questions, part of it is about talking about things not just in your own terms, but in theirs. So being like, here's what other critical apps look like, and here's why your K-debates get harder, right? So you want to read critical arguments against critical apps. Solid, makes sense to me. Now, here's why that's a lot harder in a world where they get to define the topic like this, right? And so this ties back into your concessionary ground arguments. I also think this makes sense in terms of the way you talk about like topicality at the beginning of the process, maybe the very first one where you're like, you could obviously, like, we think carbon taxes are topical. We think all these other things aren't. Use more of those kinds of examples when you're sitting your T arguments. Like, look, it's not just K apps we're excluding, by the way. There are other kinds of apps we think are bad. For example, if you don't take a big enough shift from the status quo, if you're the Trump-proofing CPP apps, if you're the Trump-proofing Paris apps, that's not any better, right? Because we still don't get the same kinds of uniqueness and other kinds of ground, right? So in that way, you're providing a much more sort of fleshed out, and it starts to sound a little less us versus them, which is, I think, a move you want to try to make, so that you don't constantly feel like you're in the us versus them debate, which both is tiring and not fun. The last thing and I have lots of other things, but I will let other people out of this room. The last thing I'll say is this, which is that I think that when you're going to go for these sorts of arguments, you need to do a better job, and they do too, to some extent, but there has to be sort of more of a rich description about the thing they do that makes it bad, not just the thing they do that makes it not great, right? And so it can't just be that they, like, make the debate, like, so when you're talking about their interpretation, you should be like, it's not just that it makes it unpredictable, you should say, here are other apps. By the way, all of their apps that they're talking about are not things their interpretation would include. Private sector's libidinal economy is not something that Louisville would have been like, yes, that. Right? The Louisville apps have never talked about the libidinal economy. Other K apps don't talk about the libidinal economy, which means that it's not just that they also exclude because they have an interpretation, it's that their interpretation excludes some of the people that they're still talking about. Rutgers staff is not about that necessarily, right? It's not even about most of the things they talk about as greenhouse gas emissions. Right? So, and I think that's one of the spaces where you just have to clue in, and I think that that's probably the problem of, like, ye old giant overview, despite me mocking you a little bit for it in the debate, is that it's not so much that you have it, it's that it means you're not debating in the context of what's happening, right? It means you're reacting to that stuff later, and that's always going to put you behind, right? Because the more generic that stuff gets, the harder it is, because then there's just a lot of it to drag together in the end.
Yeah, I will say that I think that my decision kind of came down to a lot of like really techy things. So I was just like, yeah, I don't have like a like line by line on direct answer to this. I think that like what Lindsay is saying, you got really close to saying a lot of arguments throughout the debate that I was like, this is really smart and clearly a negative thing. Like what she just said, your interpretation would still exclude a vast majority of what the asked about. Like you got close to saying that. You were like, because their interp has limits, it means that like it can't solve, which is like it's not the argument. It's like you identified a place where there's an answer that you need to be making to their argument. You like got a little bit there, but you didn't really make it an offensive argument. So just like spending a little bit more time in the debate flagging down like what about the app is like inconsistent with the impacts that they are going for, and then sitting on those places. Because I think that you have like it's clear that you know where those places are throughout this debate. It's just like making sure that you get the full explanation of that.
So that definitely. I don't have a lot of questions right now just because like I wasn't
You're
really
close
thinking,
to the
I wasn't really thinking about it. But if I think of any, I'll let you know. Thanks for doing this today.
You're close to that thing. Thank you all the time. Well, you could do it. Thank you all.
Yeah, good luck.
Absolutely. Good luck. Have fun. No, you're totally fine.
Better framework.